China looks to beef up its military. Will Japan change its ways? And the worst way to spend $140,000. I'm Steve Miller. These stories and more are on the March 30th edition of Asian News Weekly. Greetings and salutations, my excellent friends. Welcome to Asian News Weekly, and I would like to thank you for spending part of your week with me. Before I get into this week's show, I do want to say thank you so much for supporting Asian News Weekly in the past few weeks. Now, since I started podcasting, my podcasts have always been available through your favorite RSS-based podcast client or through the iTunes store. Now, recently, one of my listeners made a request to add Asia News Weekly to Stitcher. Now, it took a few days, but now Asia News Weekly is part of Stitcher. You can listen online at Stitcher.com or through their mobile applications. Simply search for Asia News Weekly and you'll find the podcast. If you have a favorite podcasting site that you would like me to syndicate Asia News Weekly on, please let me know. Drop a comment or shoot me an email at podcast@chiranger.com because I'm all about trying to share news, trying to share stories, and getting the conversation going about what's happening here in Asia. So before we get into the news stories, let's revisit some of the great comments that came about from last week's. The first comment came from 69 Phuket, who was talking about military action possibly in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. 69 Phuket writes, "Any military action will not be localized. Everything has been planned out." And in response to the IKEA story last week, 69 Phuket writes, "An utensil holder is a great hobo stove." Now, personally, that's something I really can't see. Using a utensil holder as a hobo stove. It sounds ingenious. It sounds like something right up my alley. And when I get the next chance to go to an IKEA, I'm going to have to check out one of these utensil holders to see if I can make it a hobo stove. Now, another great comment came from Critique Cat. And this is what Critique Cat had to say. "I think South Korea should focus more on the reunification with the North than wasting so much time with Japan. I don't think South Korea should accept Japan's stance or give up its position, but just to ignore it completely. I don't see any meaning in both prime ministers meeting. Also, about the death sentence. Jails are the ultimate proof that most people on this planet are still very ignorant. How is locking a person in a room for several years going to change anything? If you want to change the actions of a person, you must change his way of thinking, the information that he has in his brain. His information will not change in any way by sitting in a room for a number of years. You must understand what made this guy do whatever he has done, and then re-educate him. Change his way of thinking by education, not by locking him in a room and leaving him there." And finally, from Calidus, "Economic sanctions on any country is basically a declaration of war. Sanctions are always a bad idea historically. The people who have to live day to day in the country being sanctioned are the ones that suffer, not the leaders." And while I personally wouldn't necessarily go that far, I do agree that those in power are rarely affected by sanctions. These are some great comments about the stories I shared in last week's episode, so I encourage you again, as you listen to the stories in Asia News Weekly, tweet your responses to me, share them on the podcast pages. So let's go ahead and get to it. This past week, South Korean President Park Geun-hye and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe met formally for the first time in The Hague in a meeting arranged by President Obama and the United States. The meeting represented the first formal talks between Park and Abe since they took office more than a year ago. Park has avoided a meeting with Abe in protest of Japan's stance on issues related to the country's 1910 to 1945 colonial rule of Korea. The binding force behind the meeting was North Korea and how to contain the so-called rogue nation. Relations between South Korea and Japan have been at one of their worst points in recent years due to Tokyo's refusal to address its forced recruitment of Korean women into sexual slavery during World War II and its repeated claims to South Korea's easternmost islets of Dokdo. Korea-Japan relations can be tumultuous as there are many obstacles ahead, said Hong Hyung-ik, a senior analyst at South Korea's Sejong Institute think tank, referring to a series of historical issues that could freeze the hard-won atmosphere of reconciliation at any time. Hong continues, Japan appears to have made a conciliatory gesture in order to avoid isolation, but I don't see much sincerity, he said. In the future, South Korea and Japan should reset their relations, but they have a long way to go. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts and again last week, the meeting between Park and Abe was mainly for show. It was done largely to appease the United States and nothing more. Abe didn't give in to any of Park's demands, and nothing has really changed between South Korea and Japan. The issues that have strained the relations between Korea and Japan weren't discussed, meaning the meet was nothing more than a photo opportunity. Many have rushed to say that relations are thawing between South Korea and Japan, and there are some signs of that, but fundamentally, things remain the same. In my opinion, politically, there just isn't enough motivation to expend the necessary capital to move things forward. Unless it becomes advantageous for the two nations to mend ties, expect the situation to remain stalled. Well, those are my thoughts on the situation. What are yours? Was the meeting in The Hague the first step in mending ties between Seoul and Tokyo? Or was this just a photo op to make Obama happy? Please share your thoughts via Twitter or leave them on the comment page. It appears that one of the United States' concerns might be manifesting with China. China brought up recently that it thought the United States wasn't being completely honest in sharing all data from its military aircraft in search for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, for fear of giving China insight into technology the U.S. had developed. While that may or may not be true, one thing is certain. China has taken notice of the large number of anti-submarine aircraft being deployed as part of the search effort. China currently has the third largest submarine fleet in the world, and it wants to make sure it can maintain that it can protect its assets. So if we take a look at other regional powers, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia have all purchased Lockheed P-3 Orion anti-submarine aircraft from the United States. The United States has also deployed Boeing P-8 Poseidon aircraft in Japan. With the help of the P-3C patrol aircraft, the Royal Australian Navy detected debris which could potentially be part of the wreckage of Flight MH370. An anti-submarine aircraft like the P-3C can stay in the sky for over 10 hours on patrol missions. And China doesn't have a resource like that. They must rely on actual ships for surveying areas. This crisis has unwittingly identified a glaring hole in China's naval capabilities. It's a move China is looking to correct either by developing their own anti-submarine aircraft or by purchasing aircraft from allies. With growing tension in the region, the increase in military spending by China could stress things even further. Now, personally, I am actually shocked that China doesn't already have such aircraft on hand, as their use has been pretty standard in the United States for years. Perhaps it shows a lack of foresight on China's part when they actually extended their maritime border into the South China Sea. If they don't have the resources to really patrol it, can they effectively control it? So my question to you is this. Do you feel that China equipping themselves with sub-hunters will escalate things in the disputed area in the South China Sea? Please tweet your answer or leave it on the podcast page. We need to strive to improve the inter-Korean relations, but it is wrong if it causes our discussions for the reunification to be neglected, said Unification Minister ROK-JPN. He continued, better inter-Korean ties do not always guarantee national reunification. And for decades, we've paid little attention to the crucial and comprehensive issue of unification. And this should be a main, regular issue on the table. He called for Koreans as well as the international community to join in the effort. He continues, South Korea successfully achieved the project of developing the country decades ago. Now it is time to push for the reunification project to perfect the nation. Reunification of the Korean Peninsula is not a matter of choice, but a must that will give people hope and opportunities, Ru said. Sadly, reunification is nothing more than a pipe dream at this moment. With political ideologies light years apart, no common ground is to be found to form a single government. The continued romanticism by South Korean government officials for one day having a unified country in their lifetime, in my opinion, actually hampers the process, because it prevents them from enacting necessary policies that could actually bring about change in North Korea. I would welcome an end to the perpetual conflict, the demilitarization of the border, and the economic development of North Korea, so that in time, the nation could heal and be unified. But the truth of the matter is, Kim doesn't want that unless it's under his control. Unless the Ministry of Unification can recruit high-ranking members of the Kim regime and encourage them to overthrow the government, their plans are going nowhere. Some Japanese companies are concerned about Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's forceful diplomacy with neighbors like China at a time when demand from Asia's giant appears to be ebbing, according to a new Reuters survey. More than half of the executives in the Reuters corporate survey said demand from China is peaking or declining. In the report, a quarter are concerned about the impact of Abe's approach to foreign policy, which has inflamed tensions with China and South Korea. 46% said it had no effect on them, while 29% said they were unsure. On territorial issues, it's natural to protect Japan's interests and positions, said an executive at an electrical equipment company. But I would like to see more humility regarding issues that are sensitive not only for China and Korea, but globally, like the understanding of history, the Yasukuni Shrine visit, and the place of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals. Obstinately insisting on these issues could erode trust in Japan and damage national interests, not only economically, but also from the perspective of the international standing of Japanese people. The Reuters corporate survey of 400 firms was conducted between March 3rd and March 14th, which is split evenly between manufacturers and non-manufacturers. The results are interesting and reflect what I've been saying all along. While Prime Minister Abe is free to act as he chooses, he must also be cognizant of how those actions affect others and how they will be interpreted overseas. In my experience, politicians over time bow to the will of whomever is bankrolling them. Maybe it's a pessimistic look at politics, but I think a fairly pragmatic one. It's something we've seen time and time again, where a candidate stumps making a wide range of promises, only to fall flat when they get in office because the people don't really pay the bills. What are your thoughts on the story? Should Abe stick to his guns, or should he heed the advice of big business in Japan and approach things from a more neutral stance? A second South Korean intelligence officer attempted suicide this past week. It's the latest in an ongoing scandal that continues to erode the credibility of the nation's spy agency. According to a report in the Wall Street Journal, the agent, only identified by his surname of Kwon, was found unconscious in his car in a Seoul suburb. Coal ash was found inside the car in what appeared to be an attempt at carbon monoxide poisoning. Mr. Kwon had been stationed at the South Korean consulate in Shenyang, located in China's northeastern sector. He was there until he was recently recalled to Seoul. He has been under investigation by prosecutors for his possible involvement in falsifying evidence against a North Korean defector, according to South Korean media. Mr. Kwan's suicide attempt is the second such incident this month involving the National Spy Agency. Another individual employed by the agency has been hospitalized since earlier this month after a separate suicide attempt, though the NIS has declined to say whether the attempt was linked to the man's involvement in the case. It is a tragedy when one person attempts to take their life. South Korea, after all, has a very high rate of suicide. In many studies, the highest in the developed world. However, when two people attempt suicide and are linked to the same criminal investigation where allegations of falsified evidence is being examined, one has to wonder if the events are truly unrelated. While there is no evidence linking the two suicide attempts, it certainly isn't out of the realm of possibility, given the actions of the NIS during the previous presidential elections. What are your thoughts? Do you think the suicide attempts are unrelated? Could these two men simply be troubled souls wanting to take the easy way out? Or could there be a larger cover-up or conspiracy at play? A month has passed since the 2014 Winter Olympics came to a close in Sochi, but for some, the painful defeat of Queen Yona by Russia's Adelina Sotnikova hasn't abated. As a result, the Korean Olympic Committee and the Korean Skating Union will file a formal complaint about the judging of the women's event to the International Skating Union's Disciplinary Committee. In a statement, the Korean Olympic Committee and the Korean Skating Federation called the judging of Kim, quote, unreasonable and unfair. The complaint alleges violations of the IOC Code of Ethics based on the presence of two particular judges on the panel of the free skate and on, quote, suspicions of bias by other judges, end quote. Quote, by making it official that the judging was unfair, the KOC and the KSU will do our best to prevent any unfair incidents to Korean athletes in the international skating and sports world, the statement said. International Skating Union rules allow filing of complaints to the Disciplinary Commission within 60 days of the events in question. However, formal Olympic judging protests are to be made within 30 minutes of the events, and that did not occur. South Korea identified the judges whom it thought possibly did not fairly evaluate the match, citing Alla Shekhovsteva, wife of Valentin Pisayev, former president of the Russian Figure Skating Federation, its current general director, and who was seen hugging Sotnikova after her skate. Another was Yuri Balkov from Ukraine, who was suspended for 1 year for result fixing in 1998. Looking at the event, even after all this time, does elicit some serious questions as to whether or not the judging panel was truly impartial. Overall, many of the technical skills from Sotnikova's skate were better performed. In a sport where technical skills outweighed artistry, it may have boosted her over the top of Korea's beloved ice queen. Ultimately, this challenge will befall the organizations that monitor the sport. They need to strike a balance between athleticism and artistry. What makes figure skating so endearing is the manner in which it's presented, the music, the costumes, the routine. By overemphasizing technical aspects of the program, those in charge are actually in danger of killing it. Why put any effort into creating a program if one can simply win by completing the most jumps, the most spins, and the most combinations within a given time limit? If it becomes all about points, then what made figure skating a great sport will be lost. This controversy highlights the subjective nature of the sport, but also shows that spectators prefer artistry more than technical ability. They want to see the difficult jumps, but they desire to see them performed flawlessly, set to music, and in a passionate tale. The skating bodies need to make relevant changes to reflect this and bring back the so-called art lead, What are your thoughts? Is South Korea beating a dead horse? Will the controversy bring about another change in figure skating's scoring system? Please share your thoughts with me. South Korean media have reported and are focusing on a 4-year-old court ruling that allows a convicted tycoon to pay off a $23 million fine with just a month and a half of prison labor. The media, to its credit, is questioning the fairness of a decision that values his daily work behind bars 10,000 times higher than that of a regular convict. The controversy came to light when Jae-ho, who is 71, the former chairman of the Daeju Group, returned home over the weekend to be taken into a prison labor facility after years of living overseas to avoid paying fines for tax evasion and embezzlement. A local court in 2010 ordered him to pay 25.4 billion won, which comes out to be about $23 million, as a fine or do prison labors for 50 days. The court actually valued his daily labor rate at 500 million won, compared to the usual 50,000 won a day for ordinary convicts. 2 weeks ago, it was noted in the podcast comments that if someone has enough money, they can simply wave it around and get off from serious crimes without feeling any remorse. I liken that to so-called celebrity justice, and this is perhaps one of the worst cases I've ever seen. The concept of equal pay for equal work is one that is rarely put into action in Korea. If you go to a more prestigious university, you can instantly demand a higher salary regardless of your abilities. If you're a woman, forget about being paid as much as a man for the same role, since Korea has one of the largest wage gaps in the world. The notion the court has perpetuated that prison work performed by one criminal is valued 10,000 times more than anyone else is absurd. It's a miscarriage of justice and shows clear signs of preferential treatment. If two individuals are performing the same tasks, then the value should be the same. No conceivable logical reason could be issued for that ruling. However, the Korean public cried out, and it appears the court is willing to revisit the matter and develop a more equitable solution. And now for something just a little bit different. It's being reported that on an episode of the Japanese television show Watashi no Nani ga Ikenai no, a man spent $140,000 on plastic surgery to make him more attractive. Women on the show said that there was no way they'd ever go for him, meaning that his exuberant procedure was for naught. Now, recently I conducted an exercise in my conversation class at my university, in which I asked my students what they would do if they were given $100,000. I told them that they couldn't save it and it had to be spent within 2 months. I was shocked to find out that several women in the class said that they wanted head-to-toe body makeovers. It should be noted that these young women were not overweight or unattractive, but societal norms made them feel inferior. And personally, I think that is a shame. Not only for the man in this particular story, but for my students. Fundamentally, this all comes down to self-esteem. Knowing you're worth something. Confidence is incredibly sexy, and that's what these individuals are lacking. Do not let anyone tell you you're not good enough or that you're not beautiful enough. True beauty comes from within. If you own your beauty, if you stop letting others define you, then others will see you for who you really are. And that's what is really needed. While the United States has the largest amount of plastic surgery, South Korea has the highest rate per capita. What are your thoughts on elective plastic surgery? Last year, I mentioned that China issued a set of guidelines for its citizens when traveling abroad. They did this because the government was concerned that the citizens were getting a bad rap when traveling overseas to countries like Japan and even locally in Hong Kong. These tips, let's just be honest, they were odd. They included things like don't pee into a bottle at the dinner table and don't sit for extended periods of time on the toilet. But it appears that the government has now issued a new series of tips aimed at helping its citizens when traveling to America. Now, there are a total of 12, and I picked out a few of my personal highlights. They don't realize how weird it is just to call them by their first name. Americans do not pay attention to, quote, status, especially social status. Most Americans do not want their relationship with you to be affected by age or social standing. If you act especially respectful to them, they will be uncomfortable. Many Americans feel even Mr., Mrs., or Miss titles are too polite. Regardless of age, everyone likes to be called by their first names. However, if you feel bad using their first names, you can just smile at each other. They deliberately do their own laundry. America is a do-it-yourself country. Americans in general, whether doctors, professors, businessmen, or lawyers, do their own cooking, laundry, shopping, and other work. In fact, many Americans can afford to spend money to have cooks and drivers, but they do not do so. They prefer to enjoy a quiet family, and if the family has a hired helper, there is less sense of quiet. When the American family eats, the food is either served from a central dish or the host or hostess gives out food to guests. Most families do not have a waiter. The cook is usually the wife, and the husband makes the cocktails. And I'm not really sure where they got this last one. Shorts plus high heels equals call girl. Americans dress casual and wear a variety of clothing in public places. Most of the time, they like to wear t-shirts, jackets, jeans, sweatshirts, and sneakers. They dress exquisitely clean. Men's pants do not expose their underpants. Women's dresses cannot expose their petticoat. Women should wear stockings with a nice skirt, not shorts with high heels. Otherwise, they will be mistaken for call girls. Painted eyebrows and thick lipstick is another sign. However, anyone can wear a vest or pajamas in public. Overall, I thought the list quite tongue-in-cheek, but mainly focused on a 1950s image of the United States. It's almost as if I was watching an episode of Leave It to Beaver. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. From an outsider's perspective looking in on America, is the Chinese government's list a hit or is it a miss? Thank you for joining me this week. For more information about any of the stories I mentioned, please check out the show notes at chiranger.com and be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section. If you would like to give me some feedback about this podcast, please, I welcome them. You can drop me a line at podcast@chiranger.com. Now, every day I share pictures and video about my life and travels, so if you really want to see what life in Asia is like, be sure to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Chi Ranger there. That's at QI Ranger. You can also find the Asia News Weekly podcast in iTunes and Stitcher. And if you use either of those services, I'd really appreciate you taking a moment to rate the podcast there. Well, that's it for this week's episode. So until next time, remember to stay true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is written and produced by Steve Miller and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.